Hello, Mike. Thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you putting the time aside. Just to jump straight in, did you want to give me and the people listening and watching a bit of an insight into who you are, what your background is, and what your role is?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me, Joe. It's awesome to be here today. So my name's Mike Dukes. I look after what we call the flexible compute business here in the UK and also for the Ireland market as well. And effectively, flexible compute is looking to use the cloud in a more flexible way with some key compute services. So we look after auto-scaling groups. We look into a bit of Graviton. We're also starting to look into more of a technology called Carpenter, which is effectively Kubernetes optimization. But one of the core bits of our business is Ec2 Spot and AWS spare capacity. So hopefully a good conversation we can have on that today. There's a lot of misconceptions around what Spot is and how people can get the best out of it. So yeah, really cool to be here.
Brilliant. Okay. And before we go into Spot, we'll give a kind of an overview on what that is and the kind of misconceptions. But what's your background? What's led to you being in this position now? Because if you're running the flexible compute business for UK and Ireland, that's not just your first job, right? You obviously build up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my actual background comes from DevOps. So I was very much a hand-on DevOps engineer in a consulting company. Started up very much an engineering level, looked up to kind of starting to manage teams, very much looking to kind of enabling DevOps across lots of different areas and lots of different industries as well. Had a really good stint in innovations places and some other areas too. So yeah, typically I've come from this initial engineering background, gone up more into strategy in the consulting world, and then kind of hopped over to AWS about a year and a half ago, where effectively, looking into this more business growth role, looking after this area of the business. And it's great because it's a mixture of technology focused. We have to know the technologies inside and out. But yeah, it's a really great role to be in.
What was one of the biggest mindset shifts from when you went from engineer to consulting? Because they're two quite different roles, aren't they?
Yeah, so effectively, I was an engineering consultant to start with. So effectively, it was still a level of consulting, but it's very much about what was really great for me is actually being on that curve of DevOps and watching people and companies grow and jump onto that. So very much the best practices that we were doing around configuration management, environment management, automation, putting those DevOps practices as part of developers lifecycle, CI/CD. They were all very kind of early days, about 10 years ago, when we started out doing it. So it was really useful for us to be that kind of hand-on engineering automation way and almost grow that up the kind of cycle. It also really helped us be quite unique in terms of mentality, a DevOps mentality as well. So it was really great jumping on the DevOps and mixing in with Agile, and it's really driven that focus. So going from engineer was really taking those kind of core DevOps practices all the way up. And even now, even to the day now, is all thinking about how we can do it more efficiently. Are we thinking in a really agile way? Obviously, there's loads of great books now, like Lean Startup and things like that, that really focus on customer first and areas like that. They all kind of tie in together really nicely, I think. But for sure, that engineering process and what I learned back in the day is still something that I keep in this job now.
So is DevOps a job or is it a methodology?
Great question. It's a way of thinking, I think. But it's if we think about what DevOps actually is, right? It's bringing, the whole premise of it was to bring the operations and the development together. So it was all thinking about how can we transition from the people that want to create new code, want to be releasing features quickly, versus the other side of the fence of people that wanted to keep code stable, wanted to keep service stable, and things about no change. And it was all about branching that together. So there's loads of different areas and mentalities that you can do. And I think that's what's also really nice, is that we've seen DevOps crop up in loads of different spaces as well. So DevSecOps, so it's basically taking that mentality to security. We've got it all over those kind of different flavors. And what's really interesting is it's really that method. It doesn't matter whether your role's called DevOps, whether it's not. It doesn't matter if you're doing it as part of just as a developer. You're bringing in those best practices. What's really nice is it's taking those key principles, automation first, fast change, stable change, thinking about automation in that pipeline and all the way to the end. And it's taking those principles and applying it to anywhere and any job. And I think that's really, really cool.
Good answer. As a DevOps recruiter, I probably would have said something
Okay.
if not less detailed. So, Mike, overall, we're here to talk about Spot. So do you want to give us a bit of a sort of premise on Spot? And I know there are so many misconceptions. So, high level, do you want to just tell us what those are and what you're here to debunk?
Yeah, for sure. So Spot, if you're not familiar with Spot and what that is, it's effectively spare capacity on AWS. So if you think around how AWS works, it's a cloud. The whole point of the premise of the cloud is to be more scalable. And if you think around that, we always have to have spare capacity. So Spot is effectively a mechanism that allows you to take that spare capacity. It allows you to use it at discounted rates. There are obviously caveats for using that too. But it's a really, really useful mechanism to really optimize spend. And we have loads of customers that are making use of it, saving huge amounts of their cloud spend by switching over to Spot and spare capacity. But more often what we see is that people are quite challenged by the older misconceptions of Spot. So when AWS launched it back in the early EC2 days, it was a bidding mechanism. It's no longer the case. It's much more easy to adopt now. And it's definitely a mechanism that people can make use of more, particularly around the workloads in things like containers and very kind of modern infrastructure and applications.
So when it comes to cloud spend, and if we're talking about sort of cloud native and Kubernetes usage, those are two of the biggest kind of concerns for startup businesses, right? When they're worried about their container costs, when they're worried about their cloud costs in general. So is Spot a way for them to really plan ahead rather than having, I don't know, 24 clusters spun up, not being used for 2 years, and then realizing they've got a huge bill? So is Spot kind of used before that happens?
Yeah, so it ties more into that flexible compute theme, and that's almost why my role title is flexible compute. It's about using the cloud, only using what you need to use, and doing it in a best practice way, so that you can have capabilities such as Spot and make use of spare capacity for that optimization. In terms of when you put it in that journey, it's entirely up to the customer. Like, we find that actually a lot of our customers like to start with Spot, like to put it in that best practice way, so that from the very beginning of their journey, they're able to keep their costs and their cloud costs to a really efficient, optimal place. If we're at another place where customers have had long-term Kubernetes clusters running for ages, they've had more of these static infrastructure and clusters running, then it's more of a case of saying, right, well, the nature of what a container is it should be immutable. Your Kubernetes cluster is the thing that manages those containers, so that if one goes down or a node goes down, it's able to switch it across. So it's really, really ideal for using spare capacity, because if the spare capacity is effectively coming and going, your Kubernetes cluster will be able to handle it. So wherever you are on the journey, there is room to pick up Spot. We like to say more now, pick it up from the beginning, because you're then building those best architecture practices into your Kubernetes clusters and your applications. But effectively, also, if you've got a long-standing cluster, now might be the time to think about switching over to using that spare capacity, because by the nature of what the container technology is, it works really, really well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can see obviously the problems it's solving. And when you think about KubeCon in Valencia recently, and even the KubeCon before that in North America as well, there was big talks, I know, on cost optimization, on cloud spend, and there's companies dedicated purely to that one ethos now, which is how do you optimize your cloud spend? How do we reduce your cloud spend? There's a whole companies that have been spun up over the last 3, 4, 5 years just dedicated to that.
Yeah, loads. Like FinOps is a huge thing at the minute, right? I think Spot is one of those secret recipes actually that people don't use enough of. Like, honestly, like generally, like when we go in and we talk about actually how much easier it is to use now, I think that's one area that we're seeing that more customers can make use of. The nice thing about Spot versus like savings plans and RIs is that you also don't have to commit to that long-term usage. So a lot of these companies have kind of thought about making use of RIs or savings plans, whereas Spot, because it's spare capacity, it comes at a discounted rate, you don't have to commit to those long-term savings. So that's why it's really, really ideal for things like containers and Kubernetes. But absolutely is a high topic at the minute. We particularly see it across all segments. We see it like some of the larger enterprise customers that are trying to cut the costs, some of the digital, more native customers that are trying to bring in early on, or even from startups when we're saying that, okay, they've got a very restricted budget on what they can spend on the cloud, and actually why not make use of these mechanisms and these cost savings from the beginning.
Yeah, because a startup, if they had spiraling cloud costs, that would just take them under.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. So,
okay, cool. Well, Mike, over to you.
One of the first things I just wanted to kick off with was do a bit of this myth busting and checking in on where people's conceptions are with Spot. And these are some of the common things that when we talk to customers that we actually find there's a lot of misunderstanding, or not necessarily a lot of knowledge about what the latest features around Spot. So kicking off with the first one, this is the most common kind of question that we have is, oh, I know Spot, it's that bidding mechanism that we use. And that's just not the case anymore. So back in 2017, we actually did away with bidding for Spot instances. And how the pricing is set by Spot now is actually determined by long-term supply and demand. So AWS set the price of a Spot instance. That includes setting the price of the discount. And that is set by looking at the long-term supply and demand of when a data center uses it. We've got loads of mechanisms for you being able to look at the percentage discount that it currently is, looking at history over the last 30 days. But typically what we found is that when we went from bidding, we saw that in the pricing in bidding for Spot instances was very volatile. It was changing very, very quickly. You could be outbid by someone else trying to use a Spot instance. It was a bit of a nasty experience to try and get a Spot instance, and there was a lot of work to think about it. And that's making this switch over to long-term supply and demand. We found that the price went very, very spiky to very, very low and trending. And there's ways, as I said, to look in the console, or there's something called the Spot Instance Advisor, which lets you look at discounts and the changes over a certain period of time. Key thing is, it's really, really simple. I would recommend for people not to get too hung up on the discount and the price that they're getting, but making use of the Spot best practices and seeing how easy it is. Definitely give it a try. The next kind of myth bust that I like to bust is Spot instances are specific types of instances in some AWS regions. So some customers think that we keep a separate part of our data center for Spot instances. That's just not the case. So by the nature of what Spot is, it is spare capacity for AWS. So it's exactly the same infrastructure, the same hardware beneath, you get the same VM instance types. And yeah, it's really easy just to think that it's actually just spare capacity in the cloud. This one's a really interesting one. Spot is for customers looking for extreme low cost solutions. And while one of the great things about Spot is it does give you a good discount, one of the key things is that it has to be a Spot friendly workload. Due to the nature of what Spot is and being spare capacity, we need to think that actually is my workload, is the thing that I'm running on these Spot instances suitable for it? Because again, it's spare capacity. So if it fluctuates and goes down, will my workload be able to cope? And we'll talk about that a bit later. Spot is intended for non-production workloads. So again, this is a common misconception. And while I'm not saying take your production environments and switch it over to Spot, we certainly have a lot of customers that are using Spot in production. Some are using even 100% Spot in production because they're using all the best practices. They're saving huge amounts of money and spend, and it's a really, really good mechanism. Typically, we'd say start in the non-production environments, your dev environments, test it up. Think about that DevOps mentality that I was talking about earlier as well, in terms of the going from dev all the way to production, testing it out. But we certainly have a lot of customers running in production. The last one on this list is Spot is timely and difficult to implement. So one of the things that AWS have really been working on in the last few years is all the integrations that it supports. So typically, if you're using an AWS service, some of the core ones such as autoscaling groups, looking into EKS, ECS, Fargate, ECS, there's a lot of integration with Spot, and it makes it really, really simple and easy to adopt. For example, autoscaling groups is literally just a config change. You can set the percentage that you want to use Spot in that autoscaling group. So it's really, really easy. We also have loads of partners. So we work with a load of partners that either build Spot into their product or make Spot really, really easy to implement across. So there are frequent products and partners that we work with out there. Always worth looking in the partner list and the ISVs that we work with, because some of them make it really, really easy to adopt. Cool. Moving on really quickly. This is just a bit about our standard EC2, but it kind of sets the scene when we think about spare capacity. So we know that AWS has over 475 instance types. I suspect that's going to continue growing, and I think we'll see at the next reInvent that number looking more like above 500. But one of the great things about EC2 is that it lets you select the right compute type based on the purpose that you need to use it. So whether that's general purpose, whether you're thinking about compute intensive, memory intensive, you're thinking about GPU specifics. Then we've got loads of capabilities in it as well. So thinking about processor types, the speed of processes, what storage you want to associate with it, the networking, the size of it as well. There are lots of different instance types to choose from. And this is really why it's worth setting the scene here, is that actually being spare capacity, the way that it works is that you look at spare capacity across lots of different instance types. So the more flexible you are, the better use you'll get out of Spot. And I'll show a bit of a graphic representation in that in a minute. One of the other things just to note about this slide is just to mention Graviton, is just our ARM-based chip processor in the cloud. It definitely can be used with Spot. You can also use it with Spot and x86 workloads. So thinking about all the different processor types there are available, but definitely worth looking into Graviton. Potentially we can do another chat around it another time, but have a little look into that, because that's also a super cool way to work in the cloud, and it's really a great mechanism for getting price performance in terms of processing and stuff like this. So I'm just going to talk about the purchase options really quickly. I suspect everyone will know what on demand is. You effectively want to create a bit of you want to have a bit of compute in the cloud. You spin up a VM, and effectively you pay by the second. There's no long-term commitments. So this is really good for spiky, stateful workloads. So you don't know how long you're going to need it. You want it to be stateful. You want it to keep the state. This is where on demand works really, really well. We then got reserved instances and savings plans. And effectively, what that is you make a 1 or 3 year commitment, you receive a significant discount off the on-demand price, and it's really good for committed and steady state usage. But ideally, for you to commit to 1 or 3 years, you need to think about exactly what you're going to use in that kind of period of time, and think about the long-term future of compute. We then have Ec2 Spot. And the way that Ec2 Spot works is it's taking that spare capacity and it's providing a discounted rate for those instance types. So the discount can be up to 90% off the on-demand prices. We typically find that it's around 70%, the savings that you get from Spot. But the beauty of it is there's no long-term commitment. It's a really high discount. And it's really suitable for flexible workloads. And one of the key aspects of it is it needs to also be fault tolerant and stateless as well. So thinking by the nature of what it is, it's spare capacity, how will my workload cope if the spare capacity goes? And this leads us quite nicely on to thinking about spare capacity in the cloud. So here I've got a blueprint of 3 different series types. If you think about this, this expands over loads and loads of different instance types. So there's more than 475, as I said. You can see here I've got the M6G, I've got the C6I, and I've got the C6G as well. And each one of those series has a different, has 8 different sizes with it. So we've got the like C6G medium, the large, the extra large, the 2X large, 4X large, 8X large, 12X large, 16X large. So there are loads of different options in each of those series. And one of the things I was alluding to earlier is that if you think about what the cloud is, it's elastic, right? So when you want more servers, when you want to make use of more compute in the cloud, you say, right, I want more, and we have to be able to expand it. And if you think about how that's working behind the scenes, is AWS will always need to have that spare capacity so that when when customers do want new instances, they're able to grow it. So if I was to show an example of this with C6i12 extra large, I can see by this stack that effectively I'm representing the usage of capacity versus what's spare. So a caveat here, this is just an example. This isn't actually the case, but if I was to represent this here, is that I could see that the white squares represent the spare capacity pools. Effectively, how Spot works is it's taking that spare capacity, it's provisioning an instance, and it's providing me a discount on that instance because I'm making use of AWS spare capacity. And one of the things to really think about here is that this spare capacity doesn't exist just on this stack, but all these different stacks that there are available. So there is different spare capacity for different sizes, for different series, across different availability zones. So if you think this is duplicated again, and also across different regions. So if we talk a bit about how Spot actually works, I've mentioned about infrastructure. It's spare capacity. It's the same as on demand and reserved instances. There's no different in the infrastructure. Pricing we've talked about. The key thing is it's no longer bidding. It's really simple to use, and it's based on that long-term supply and demand. Interruptions. So by the nature of spare capacity, Spot instances are subject to interruption, but it will only ever be interrupted if on demand needs that spare capacity. And when we need that spare capacity back, we have a mechanism of notifications that we'll talk about very, very shortly. And the key point here is at the end is diversification and flexibility. So if you think back to that blueprint where I showed just one stack and the spare capacity it has, if you make use of different instance types, different sizes, different availability zones, and even at times regions, you can make use of more spare capacity across the cloud. It's a really, really useful and powerful thing to do to optimize your cloud spend. So let's quickly talk about interruptions. So as I said, by the nature of what Spot is, it is spare capacity. A Spot instance can be interrupted if it's needed by on demand. When this happens, AWS provide two types of notifications to enable you to handle this response in an automated way. The first type of notification that we provide is something what we call the instance rebalance recommendation. And you can think of this more as a proactive rebalance recommendation. So it's effectively saying when your instance is at elevated risk of interruption. There's a load of support and the features in integrations such as autoscaling, EKS managed node groups, and some more. And effectively, if we look at the left-hand side and see the stack of spare capacity that we have, we could say, okay, well, the spare capacity is actually shrinking in the cloud, and my instance has been selected to say, oh, this instance is at elevated risk of interruption in the future. So you might want to think about doing something. We also have another type of notification, which is called the instance termination notice. And this is much more reactive. So when you get this notifications, your interruption is imminent within 2 minutes, and you need to adjust your workload appropriately. So again, looking at the stack on the left-hand side, I can see that the spare capacity has shrunk again. I can see that I've got this notification on my instance, and it's basically saying this instance will be reclaimed in 2 minutes. The key point on this slide is actually the fact of that support with the built-in integrations. So while you can go and handle the notifications yourself, they're available in CloudWatch. You can also have a look at in EventBridge and things like this. And it's also available on the EC2 instance metadata. Effectively, if you're making use of AWS services or even some of our ISV partner products, it makes it really, really easy to handle. And you can set when the rebalance recommendation is going to adjust your workload, or when the Spot instance termination notice is going to affect that workload too. So you need to just have a think about making use of those integrations, because it makes it really, really easy to adopt and pick up those interruptions as well. One of the key things is that actually, if we look at the historical figures, we took this stat across all of the spare capacity that we have in AWS, and we found that actually 95% of the Spot instances launched in the last 3 months completed without an interruption. So this was taking all the spare capacity in AWS and having a look at a lot of different workloads and types and things like this, but it just gives us an indication of how much spare capacity there is in the cloud. And again, coming back to this key point is diversification. So if we're thinking about reducing interruptions across, the more spare capacity, the more diverse you are with the instance types that you have, we'll be able to make use of the spare capacity in the cloud. Cool. So this slide is just one of our case studies. The question that we get asked a lot is, how much spare capacity is there? And by looking at what Yellow Dog did and managing to get a huge amount of vCPUs, they were making use of just Spot for this use case. They were using 8 different instance types, they were using 2 different regions, and they were using a lot of the availability zones available to them. They scaled up to 46.7K Spot instances with, as you can see by this timescale, just over an hour. And it was really, really impressive to see how much Spot instances we could actually get on this. So while AWS won't ever give away how much spare capacity we have, there's some really good indications that there is a lot of spare capacity. The key points to take away from this is that think about that diversification. So think about those different instances, think about using all the availability zones available to you, and even in some cases regions like this customer did. So if we look at the ideal Spot workloads that we look across, we can see here that we've got a number of different workloads that Spot is really, really suitable for. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a number of criteria to think about when adopting Spot. So first of all, the workload has to be fault tolerant. How is the workload going to handle if the Spot instance is reclaimed? The second point is being flexible. The more flexible you are with your instance types, your sizes, and the spare capacity that's available, the better experience that you'll get by using Spot. Loosely coupled, so this is pretty obvious. You don't want to be putting your database on the same server as your web server and thinking about that instance getting interrupted. And the other kind of key criteria is at the bottom is around the stateless workloads as well. So is that instance storing state? If it's going to be interrupted, what's going to happen with that state as well? So it's just worth thinking about it. The key ones on this list on the right is thinking about where it works really, really well. And one of the really key points that we're seeing more and more, and a trend more and more, is containers. By the nature of what containers is, it's immutable. There are lots of container platforms out there that enable it to handle when a container gets destroyed and it needs to be recreated, such as Kubernetes. And it works really, really well in this technology. We have some customers that are, as I mentioned earlier, doing 100% Spot in production. And this is typically where it's working really, really well, is they're making use of that container platform. There's also another elements of workloads that we can think about. So looking into like web services is typically of a good use case. We've got CI/CD, so talking about that DevOps background again, we can be making use of Spot for intensive builds, such as like build servers and things like that, thinking about how your pipeline is going to respond if the Spot instance gets interrupted, but also thinking about using Spot on dynamic environments as well. And we had a really interesting use case of where we had a company that were actually using Spot interruptions as a form of testing mechanisms as well. So there's loads of potential in the DevOps space with Spot. And then finally, looking on the kind of the corner on the right-hand side, big data, AI, machine learning, and HPC and batch, is, if you think about it, they are very compute-intensive workloads. So that is something that works really, really well in Spot. They're typically technologies where you kind of go and do a huge amount of data processing. And effectively, it works really, really well to think about, right, I'm going to optimize compute usage, but also if I'm making use of techniques such as checkpointing and pausing where you get to in your say your HPC workload and coming back, then you can also make use of Spot without having to worry about the interruptions that there are available. This is a really interesting one, and this just shows different workload types that we have available, and when it's also good to mix and match. And one of the kind of misconceptions that we get as well is that you don't have to go all in on Spot, right? There's some really good use cases where we think about actually there might be times when you want to mix and match. So starting on the left-hand side, looking at databases, if you're running a database on an EC2 instance, you typically wouldn't want to put that on Spot. And that is because it's a stateful application. It's storing that state. So for that type of workload, you want to think about using RIs or savings plans, or even making use of a database service that's available. The next one along, we see stateless web apps and APIs. And you might decide that actually I'm going to do the majority of the scaling with Spot, and I might want to mix and match with my RIs and savings plans as well. And we see a lot of customers do this. As I mentioned, we also see a lot of customers going 100% in Spot because they're using such good practices. But this is also a good recommendation of when you're not ready to go all in on Spot immediately, you can think about mixing and matching as well. Looking quickly at the other ones as well, if we think about job processing, batch type workloads, they're typically things that you want to go and run. Spot is really, really good for that. We see a lot of Spot in video rendering. Streaming, it's more for that stateful workloads again, same with gaming servers. And you can see kind of across that there's balances that you can do. And really the message on this slide is to be thinking about that. Actually, I don't have to dedicate 100% of Spot. I can start with a small percentage, see how it works, really optimize my workload, and then kind of grow it to make use of those savings as well. So let's talk about Spot integrations with your workloads. And as I mentioned earlier, Spot integrates really, really easily if you're making use of certain services that we have available or products that our ISVs are looking into. So if we look at this list here, looking at the launch methods, EC2 autoscaling is a great way to start with Spot. It's typically where a lot of our kind of flagship Spot features and Spot integrations go. It's a really, really easy way to pick it up. As I mentioned earlier, you can just make use of the different config changes and do a percentage of Spot versus a percentage of on demand. So it's a really, really good way to look into it. We then have a load of application tools. So AWS Batch, ThinkBox Deadline, Elastic Beanstalk, they also support Spot. And also we have a load of service integrations. So the key ones here are our container services, so ECS, EKS, we've got Fargate for ECS as well. EMR, and we've also got SageMaker. When I'm looking at customers and customers that are already using AWS, the container services and EMR is typically a really good place to start to see that actually this is a really good place that they could probably save money from Spot. Also looking at that auto scaling group usage too. But really the point is that there's lots of integrations available. Make use of them. It makes life a lot easier. And additionally, we also have some Spot ready partners as well. So whether it's more of the HashiCorp suite, so thinking about things like Packer and Terraform, Spot integration is built into those products. So you're able to use infrastructure tools as you would with any other infrastructure tools. You've got those Jenkins and Bamboo integrations as well. So having a think about that actually Spot can go really nicely into CI/CD. Jenkins, there's a plugin and it lets you like make use of Spot natively within Jenkins. We've got other platforms such as Databricks, Cloudera, Mesos, and obviously Docker and Kubernetes is somewhere that it works really, really well. One of the key other things as well is that looking at the Spot blueprints, and I'll talk about this very, very shortly, but effectively Spot blueprints is dynamically provided reference architecture, either in CloudFormation or Terraform, that lets you look at some best practice architectures. So it's a reference where you can go and have a look in what counts as a good Spot architecture and how to use it. And that leads me really, really nicely onto some of the tools that are available with Spot. So first of all, looking at the blueprint side, we've got the dynamic infrastructure code generator. So as I said, it's a really good place to get started. It's basically that best practice reference architecture. You can select the kind of service that you want to use, and it's all there in the console. We've then got attribute-based instance selection. So this is a really, really useful tool for diversification. So rather than you having to go and select all the instance type / size that you want to use, attribute-based instance selection allows you to select instances based on attributes. So you could put, for example, a minimum and maximum CPU, you could put minimum and maximum memory, you could also put in like the chipset types that you want to use. And what it will do is it will automatically provide the instances that meets those attributes. So it's a really, really cool and useful way. The other thing about that one is it's future-proof. So you're thinking about how to, like when a new instance becomes available and you're thinking about when they get released, attribute-based instance selection will also incorporate that in. So if it reaches those attributes, it's a good one to also include. We've then got the spot placement score. So this is a really useful tool that you can, again, use straight on the console. And what it does is it lets you search for an optimal location in real time for your workload. So what you can do is you can select the instances, the regions, the AZ, and it will give you a score of 1 to 10 of what the capacity is like at that time. So this is a real-time score. And one of the things that I'd argue is whether you need to use this is if you're diversifying enough. So if you're making use of a lot of different instance types and things that are available, we can also find that actually you might not need to use this. But if there is a mechanism that you want to select a particular region and availability zone for your workload, it also allows you to see what the spare capacity is like from a score of 1 to 10. The last tool set here is the fault injection simulator. So this effectively is a form of chaos engineering. It supports the imitation of spot interruptions, and it essentially allows you to simulate what's going to happen if my workload was hit with a spot interruption. So it's a really useful way of testing. Effectively, what it does is it provides the spot notifications to the instances, and then effectively it allows you to see, oh, what's going to happen with my workload? How's my infrastructure going to handle a spot interruption or a spot rebalance recommendation? Cool. So finally, on this last slide is just around the call to action and just some key takeaways to think about. So first of all, remembering that Ec2 Spot can reduce infrastructure costs. So it's a really key and powerful tool to think about how you can really optimize your costs in the cloud. Additionally, some of the best practices that we're talking about, such as diversification and things like that, are really good cloud architectural practices. And some of the benefits that we see from that are actually you become more highly available, you're making use of more spare capacity, but even if you were using on demand, you'd effectively be considered best practices because you're thinking about those different availability zones, you're thinking about the different places to use it. And if you're really, really thinking about being more optimal in the cloud, it helps you become more sustainable as well. So a lot of the conversations that we have with flexible compute talks about how we can kind of be more optimal in the cloud, and that's a really good practice of the sustainability pillar. Considering about your workloads, so what would be the ideal workloads to look at? As I mentioned, one that we'll typically start with is containers, because those container platforms provide a really good mechanism of handling container interruptions. We've also got web services, HPC, CI/CD, big data, AI, machine learning. They are great workloads that you can make use of Spot in a really, really ideal way. We've also got, we do initiatives where you can do proof of concept. So do reach out if you want to talk about that. You can also, if you're currently with AWS, you should be assigned an account team, an account manager, and in some cases SAs. And we can definitely arrange follow-ups. So if this is a part of a workload where you're using AWS already, you can definitely reach out to us to talk about immersion days, technical deep dives, references and case studies, and provide that expert Spot support if you need it. Looking on the right-hand side, there's some really good resources here. So looking at ec2spotworkshops.com, is one of the really, really key resources that we have. You'll notice that the first 2 points are effectively the same URL. And effectively, this site is all the workshops that we offer to people that we can come and do as an immersion day, or you can just go on and do it at your self-paced and self-learning. So it's a really useful way to look at that. The resources subpage of this site also includes loads of references to blogs, other tutorials, examples, case studies. There's loads of videos on there as well, so definitely have a little look. We've also got immersion days, so have a look at workshops.aws. It's not just Spot that obviously is on there. There's loads of different workshops available, and you can see all these different things that AWS has to offer. I've put my email on here, so please feel free to reach out to me. It's mtjukes@amazon.com. So it's a really, really good one to, please feel free to reach out. Like, I'm always willing to kind of answer further questions or support if there's kind of big AWS engagements already there. So feel free to reach out.
Interestingly, one of my follow-up questions was going to be about the sustainability piece. And could you come at this from a kind of a marketing angle, or an angle where it's like a green cloud solution for your clients as well? But you answered that right at the last slide.
So it's a really interesting point, actually. So there are a number of sustainability initiatives that we have. It's worth looking into things like the carbon calculator that we have on AWS. It looks at your footprint of spend in the cloud. Effectively, AWS is a shared responsibility, so that if you look at the security shared responsibility, it's really similar. AWS will be responsible for getting their data centers more sustainable, and you as a customer of AWS are looking into that workload piece, and it's effectively that workload. How can you get more sustainable in the cloud? Really, the key premise of that is by using what you only need to use and being flexible with what you need to use too. But spare capacity also feeds into it a bit more, and I suspect we'll see more of that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are becoming a lot more conscious, or businesses, founders, C-suite execs are becoming a lot more conscious now of their cloud usage, their sort of sustainability, and what they can put out there to say that they're doing their bit. So I think that's a huge initiative. That's what I see anyway. So appreciate you can kind of give a little bit of insight into my next question, but what's on the horizon for AWS? What can you tell us about new products, new features, or what's going to get you in trouble?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a really interesting point. I think while I'm not allowed to talk about the future of services, reInvent is like one of our biggest flagship announcements. So I definitely keep an eye on what's coming at reInvent. The other thing to look at is our GitHub pages. So if you go onto GitHub and you look at the individual services that we have, be that our container services, be that things like Carpenter, you can have a look at the kind of issues that people are interested in requesting, and you can almost see any communication with other AWS engineers of where it's think about sitting. Some of them also have a bit of a roadmap on there too. So definitely have a look at there. Definitely have a look out at reInvent. That's typically where we talk about our new features and things being released. But I think a really good way is to look at those GitHub pages, because it will give you a bit of an indication of what's changing and what's coming and things like that. A lot of these are becoming more and more open source.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Thank you for that. So I know in your presentation you covered things like containers, you covered AI, ML, and a few other sort of sub areas as well. But in your personal opinion, Mike, are there any particular industries or sectors that you can see having a fantastic sort of 12 to 24 months, considering where we're at in terms of cloud native, open source, cloud adoption?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is where we sit in the flexible compute, it's so cross industry. So we're actually finding that there's so much opportunity, a bit of everywhere. I think if you look at the different kind of segments of industry and you think about, okay, from a startup perspective, this can be really useful for startups, like this conversation around flexibility, because they're typically more constrained with the budget that they can spend on the cloud and the funding that they have available for the cloud. So it's a really good place for them to start. We're also, if you look at the other end of the scale and looking at the enterprise segments and the larger customers, there's also a huge opportunity for customers to think about where they're spending and where they're going with that. Industry specific, as I said, it kind of happens everywhere. So whether they are more of a digital native business, whether they're more in the financial space, whether they're more in the retail space, we're finding that actually the adoption is pretty kind of across everywhere. There's no specific one to target and pinpoint. I think really is thinking about where it works, where the technologies that you're using works, and I think that's that's an interesting point.
Yeah, okay. I definitely feel like the rise of the startup
Yeah,
is has become a real thing. You know, startups have obviously been around for a long time, and Amazon was a startup once. But what I mean by that is there's so many more opportunities in business areas for startups to really niche in on, to really focus in on now. Like we spoke at the top of this, right, about cost optimization. So there's a whole world of cost optimization companies now that could utilize maybe Spot or take the Spot thought process and apply it in another way. Do you know what I mean? So I feel
yeah,
like there's a whole new sort of world of opportunities out there for startups. So yeah, I'd
awesome,
agree.
awesome stuff.
Closing thoughts from me. Just wanted to say thanks. And I know you mentioned it in your slides there, but where can people reach out to you specifically, Mike? Just once again.
Yeah, so always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or things like this. I'm always available to answer on stuff on there. If you'd rather just drop me an email direct, that's absolutely fine. You'll typically see me a lot at AWS events, so any summits coming up in the UK area. So yeah, please just reach out. It'd be really great to connect. Additionally, if you are an AWS customer already, you can also engage your account teams through us and just kind of ask for the Spot specialist or ask for my name directly. Always be happy to have a chat.
Where's your next in-person event?
That's a good question. I'm hoping to get to reInvent. We'll see. We'll see how we go. But I'm doing a few travels here and there and everywhere at the minute. We're also doing we're doing an event on Carpenter actually in our London Amazon office. So that's open to AWS customers. Again, if that's something that interests anyone, early September, they'll be welcome along to come to that. Just drop me an email.
Perfect. Well, Mike, thanks so much for carving out an hour of your day. I appreciate that. And for anybody that wants to reach out, please do so via LinkedIn. But thanks for watching and appreciate your time, Mike.